The galaxy had mourned humanity for 11,000 years. It had gotten very good at it. There were monuments to us on 6 worlds we never touched. Cautionary sculptures mostly, depicting a species that had reached for too much, too fast, and burned itself out somewhere between its first starship and its first century among the stars. There were academic disciplines built entirely around us. Xenohistorians who had spent their whole careers picking through the wreckage of Sol System, publishing papers with titles like Hubris and Silence, Terminal Overexpansion in Emergent Species and the Human Model, a case study in self-inflicted extinction. Children on a dozen worlds were taught our story as a bedtime warning. Reach too far, too fast, and the dark will simply close over you, quiet as water. Nobody had heard from humanity in 11,000 years. Nobody had expected to. My name is Archivist Second Class Illyra Venn, and I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of this. I did not discover the signal because I was brilliant, or because I believed in something the rest of the galaxy had given up on. I discovered it because I was bored. 3 months into a tedious cataloging assignment on the edge of what the old star chart still labeled, out of habit more than accuracy, the Sol exclusion zone. A wide, quiet stretch of space that every major galactic power had agreed, centuries ago, simply wasn't worth visiting anymore. I was a low-ranking member of the Concordate Survey Division, assigned to catalog debris fields for salvage rights, which is a polite way of saying I flew a slow ship through empty space, cross-referencing rocks against a database, for a living. My vessel, the ISV Patient Reckoning, was built for exactly this kind of unglamorous methodical work. Good sensors, terrible weapons, and enough patience baked into its design philosophy to survive years of monotony without losing its mind. On the day everything changed, I was cataloging a debris field near what my charts identified only as Designation Luna, defunct, a small dead moon orbiting a small dead planet in a system that had once, according to the oldest records still on file, been called Earth. I almost missed the signal entirely. It came in low, buried beneath the ordinary background hiss of dead machinery and ancient radiation that fills every abandoned system in the galaxy. But it had a rhythm to it, not random, not the meaningless echo of some long-dead automated system still twitching through its final protocols. A pulse. Structured. Deliberate. The kind of signal that isn't decaying, but waiting. I sat very still in my chair for a long moment, staring at the readout before I let myself believe what I was looking at. It was coming from the surface of the dead moon, and it had started transmitting exactly 4 hours and 11 minutes earlier. I want you to understand what that meant, because I didn't understand it myself at first, not fully. Humanity had been silent for 11,000 years. Every serious xenohistorian in the galaxy agreed on the broad shape of what had happened to us, even if the details were debated endlessly in academic journals nobody outside the field ever read. A species that expanded too aggressively, fought itself as often as it fought anything else, and eventually collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, taking its homeworld and most of its early colonies down with it. The wreckage in Sol System, and there was a great deal of wreckage, had always been read as a monument to failure. A graveyard catalogued and studied and eventually mostly ignored. Nobody had ever suggested that anything down there was still on. I ran the signal through every decryption and pattern recognition tool the Patient Reckoning had, and it resolved, disturbingly quickly, into something that looked less like a distress call and more like a command sequence, a structured repeating activation code, broadcasting on a frequency band that matched, according to my ship's admittedly patchy historical database, old human orbital communication standards. Something down there wasn't dying. Something down there was being told to wake up. I did the responsible thing, which is to say I panicked slightly, made myself a cup of something warm to hold on to, and then filed an emergency report to Concordate Survey Command, flagging the signal as a Class 1 anomaly and requesting immediate guidance. While I waited for a response, I did what any archivist trained to catalog rather than act would do. I kept working the sensors, trying to understand the shape of what I was looking at before anyone with more authority than me arrived to take the discovery out of my hands. The signal, I discovered, wasn't originating from a single point on the moon's surface. It was distributed, Dozens of separate transmitters, buried at intervals across the whole hemisphere I could observe, all synchronized to within fractions of a second of one another. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen through simple decay either. Something had been actively, continuously maintaining that synchronization for a very long time. I ran a structural scan of the surface immediately surrounding the strongest transmitter cluster, and found something that made me sit back hard in my chair. Beneath a thin, undisturbed layer of ancient dust, the scan resolved clean, geometric shapes, vast, structured chambers, entirely too regular to be natural formations, running deep beneath the lunar crust in a network that extended, as far as my sensors could tell, across almost the entire visible hemisphere. Whatever this moon actually was, it had never been the barren, forgotten rock every star chart in the Concordate's archive insisted it was. The response took 6 hours to arrive, which in bureaucratic terms is essentially instantaneous, and told me everything I needed to know about how seriously my superiors were taking this. The message was short. Maintain position. Do not approach the source. Record everything. A senior archival team is being dispatched. No further explanation. No reassurance. Just the particular clipped urgency of an institution that had just realized one of its oldest and most comfortable assumptions might be wrong. I maintained position, I recorded everything, and I watched. The signal ran for 6 days before anything else happened, pulsing at steady, unhurried intervals, as if whatever had sent it was in absolutely no rush at all, confident that eventually, somewhere, someone would be listening. I spent those 6 days doing what any reasonable archivist would do. I read everything the Concordate's databases had on humanity, all 11,000 years of secondhand, reconstructed, frequently contradictory history, trying to understand what exactly I might be listening to. Most of it painted the picture I already knew, humans as a cautionary tale, brilliant and self-destructive in roughly equal measure, gone before they'd had the chance to become anything more than a warning. But buried in an obscure appendix of an old survey report, filed by a Concordate expedition that had passed through Sol system nearly 9,000 years earlier, was a detail that hadn't made it into any of the popular histories. The expedition had found the moon's surface catalogued with something the surveyors described, with visible confusion as extensive automated industrial infrastructure, dormant but structurally intact, purpose unclear. They'd found underground vaults, sealed and undisturbed, containing what their scanners identified as terraforming platform components. Thousands of them, mothballed rather than destroyed, arranged with what the report called an unsettling degree of deliberate organization for a species assumed extinct through catastrophic collapse. The expedition had recommended further study. Further study had never happened. It was easier, I think, for a very old and very comfortable galaxy to file humanity away as a finished story than to ask why a supposedly extinct species had left behind machinery that looked less like the wreckage of a collapse and more like something carefully, deliberately put to sleep. I found 2 more references buried in even older records, cross-filed under categories so obscure it took my ship's research assistant most of a day to surface them. One was a brief note from a Concordate trade envoy who had passed near the system almost 10,000 years earlier, remarking almost in passing that local automated beacons had responded to standard hail protocols with what appeared to be a deliberately incomplete acknowledgement, present but unwilling to fully engage. The envoy had filed it as a curiosity and moved on. The other was older still, a fragment of a survey log so degraded I could only recover perhaps a third of its content. But the surviving portion included a phrase that stopped me cold when I finally parsed the translation. Structures show clear evidence of intentional dormancy protocol, not damage. Recommend system be flagged for long-term monitoring rather than salvage. That recommendation, too, had never been acted on. Somewhere in the long, slow, bureaucratic drift of a galaxy, with a great many systems to catalog and a great deal of comfortable certainty about which ones mattered, humanity's careful, deliberate silence had simply been misread, generation after generation, as a grave rather than a held breath. On the 6th day, the moon woke up. I was recording when it happened, which meant that what followed exists now, permanently, in a data file that has since been viewed by more sentient beings across more star systems than almost any recording in galactic history. I've watched it back myself more times than I'd like to admit. The pulse changed rhythm first, subtly then unmistakably, shifting from a slow, patient heartbeat into something faster, more insistent, like a countdown finally reaching its final numbers. Then across the surface of that small, supposedly dead moon, lights began to appear. Not scattered randomly, but in patterns, long, straight lines resolving into what my sensors eventually identified as launch corridors, dozens of them, running from deep underground facilities up toward the surface. I watched enormous doors buried under millennia of undisturbed lunar dust grind open for the first time in longer than most galactic civilizations had existed. And then I watched something come out of them that made me set my recording equipment on the highest priority archival setting I had, because I understood even in that first stunned moment that I was looking at something the entire galaxy needed to see: swarms. Not weapons, not warships. Swarms of small, unmanned, autonomous platforms, thousands upon thousands of them, rising from the lunar surface in slow, coordinated waves, their formation shifting with a precision that spoke of decision-making, not simple pre-programmed repetition. My systems eventually classified them, after considerable effort, as terraforming seed units, small, self-replicating platforms designed to travel, land, and begin the slow, patient work of transforming dead or damaged worlds into something livable again. They didn't head for Earth. Earth, my sensors confirmed, remained exactly as dead and silent as it had been for 11,000 years, a scarred, gray ruin of a world with no atmosphere worth the name. Instead, the swarms began breaking into smaller formations, each one setting a different course, toward Mars, toward a scattering of outer moons my old records listed only by catalog number, toward debris fields and dead rock that nobody, in 11,000 years, had thought worth a second glance. They were not the remnant of a species trying to survive. They were the remnant of a species that had, apparently, planned an 11,000-year restoration project and simply gone to sleep waiting for the right moment to begin it. Quick word from the channel. Hey, before we go any further into this one, if you're new here, welcome to Deep Signal Archives, the home of original science fiction stories where humanity is never quite as gone as everybody assumes. This channel runs on people like you hitting subscribe and turning on notifications, so if you want to catch every new story the moment it drops, now's a great time to do that. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back. Genuinely, it means a lot. And we've got a lot more of this story left to go, so grab something to drink and let's get back into it. I transmitted the recording in full to Concordate Survey Command within the hour, along with a message that I will admit was considerably less professional than my training required. I believe the exact phrase I used was, "You need to see this immediately, and then you need to tell someone whose job title is bigger than mine, because I do not think I am the right person to be holding this information alone." The senior archival team that had been dispatched days earlier arrived 18 hours later, considerably faster than their original timeline had suggested, which told me everything about how quickly the situation had escalated through channels I wasn't cleared to see. Their lead investigator, a weathered, unhurried Vethari researcher named Doskin Urmil, boarded the patient reckoning personally, reviewed my recordings twice in total silence, and then sat back in his chair for a long moment before speaking. "You understand," he said finally, "that this changes everything we thought we knew." "I've had 6 days to get used to the idea," I said. "I'm still not sure I have." "Neither am I," he admitted, "and I've studied this species for 40 years. He gestured at the frozen frame on my display, the moon, mid-eruption, thousands of small machines rising into the dark. Every model we had assumed humanity's collapse was catastrophic and complete. War, resource exhaustion, some final unrecoverable failure. We built entire disciplines on that assumption." He was quiet for a moment. "What if we were simply looking at the aftermath of something else? Not a collapse. A withdrawal. A withdrawal to where?" I asked. "There's nothing left of them. Earth's a ruin. Every colony we've ever surveyed in this system is empty." "Empty of people," Doskin said slowly, "is not the same as empty of intention." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over. "You've studied them for 40 years, I said. In all that time, did anyone ever seriously entertain the possibility that they'd simply left rather than died? Doskin gave a short, tired laugh that had very little humor in it. There was a paper early in my career, written by a researcher named Thesakor. She argued exactly that the pattern of the ruins didn't match catastrophic collapse, that too much had been deliberately preserved, too much organized in ways that suggested planning rather than panic. She was, professionally speaking, torn apart for it. Career effectively ended. The consensus at the time was firm, and firm consensus doesn't like being questioned by a junior researcher with an unpopular theory and no direct evidence. He was quiet for a moment. I always wondered if she was right. I never expected to be sitting here 40 years later, finding out that she was. Is she still alive? Could someone tell her? She died 11 years ago, Doskin said. Not knowing. I think about that more than I'd like to. He looked back at the frozen image on my display, the moon mid-eruption, and something in his expression settled into a kind of quiet resolve. We don't have long to sit with the question either way. Let's see what happens next. We didn't have long to sit with the question. Within another 6 hours, the first terraforming swarms reached their targets, and the galaxy, whether it was ready or not, began to watch humanity's oldest machines start rebuilding what everyone had assumed was simply permanently gone. I want to describe what those first weeks looked like, because I don't think anything I say can fully capture how strange it was to watch, in real time, a system come back from the dead. The swarms that reached Mars settled across its scarred, rust-colored surface in coordinated grids, and within days, atmospheric processors, buried, we would later learn, for 11,000 years in deep underground vaults, waiting for exactly this signal, began venting carefully calibrated gas mixtures into the thin Martian air. It was slow work, the kind of project that would take generations, not days, to complete. But it was working, methodically, patiently, exactly as if the people who had designed it had always known it would eventually need to run without them. The swarms that reached the outer moons did something stranger still. They didn't terraform so much as excavate, tunneling into ice and rock with a precision that suggested they were looking for something specific, and within 2 weeks concordant sensors picked up the unmistakable heat signature of industrial forges igniting deep beneath one moon's frozen crust. Forges that, according to every record anyone could find, had been cold and silent for over 10 millennia. And the swarms that reached the old debris fields around Sol's outer edge began something that made every analyst reviewing the data go very quiet. They started collecting. Wreckage from old human warships, fragments of old colony stations, scattered and drifting for 11,000 years, were gathered, sorted, and moved. Not randomly, but toward a handful of ancient, dormant structures my sensors eventually identified as shipyards. Enormous, skeletal frameworks, dark and cold for longer than most galactic civilizations had existed, beginning, slowly and methodically, to power back on. Every major galactic power sent observers. The Concordat, the Threll Compact, the quiet, cautious Wren Assembly, who almost never involved themselves in anything outside their own borders, but made an exception apparently for this. Ships gathered at the edge of what had once been the Sol exclusion zone, keeping careful, respectful distance, watching a graveyard slowly, unmistakably, stop being one. Nobody fired on the swarms. I want to be clear about that because it would have been easy in that first tense week for someone somewhere to panic and make a catastrophic mistake. But something about watching it happen, watching machines built by a species everyone had mourned as gone quietly, patiently doing exactly what they'd clearly always been designed to do, made almost every observer hesitant to interrupt. It didn't look like an invasion. It looked like a funeral, slowly, deliberately turning into something else. Turning. I spent a good portion of those first weeks fielding requests from concordant researchers who wanted access to my original recordings, and in the process I found myself, almost accidentally, becoming something like a minor authority on events I had only stumbled into by being bored on a slow patrol shift. It was a strange kind of fame. Quiet, mostly confined to academic and diplomatic circles. but noticeable enough that I started receiving messages from historians and journalists across a dozen systems, all asking, in one form or another, the same question. What does it feel like to be the one who found them? I never had a very good answer. Mostly it felt like being handed something far too large and important for my rank, and being asked to carry it carefully without dropping it. I did my best. The Wren Assembly, in particular, took an interest that surprised almost everyone who followed galactic politics closely, because the Wren almost never engaged with matters outside their own tightly guarded borders. Their observer delegation arrived quietly, without the fanfare that accompanied the Concordat and Threll ships, and requested through official channels a private audience with whoever had discovered the original signal. I was, somewhat to my own disbelief, summoned. The Wren representative, an unhurried, soft-spoken being named Ashenkor Rel, met with me aboard a small, spare vessel that felt almost deliberately unassuming compared to the elaborate diplomatic craft the Concordat favored. We have our own history with long silences, Ashenkor told me, without much preamble. Our people withdrew from wider galactic contact for nearly 2,000 years, several millennia ago, after a conflict we do not discuss often. We understand, better than most, what it means to choose silence rather than have silence chosen for you. They studied me for a long moment. I wanted to hear, directly, from the person who listened carefully enough to notice the difference between an ending and a pause. Not every species would have. I didn't know what to say to that, and I told them so honestly. Ashenkor seemed to appreciate the honesty more than a rehearsed answer would have earned. 3 weeks after the first signal, the moon spoke again. Not a new activation pulse this time, but a message. Broadcast on every frequency the assembled observer fleet was monitoring, in a language my ship's systems took almost 4 full hours to translate properly, because it wasn't quite the same as any recorded human dialect in the Concordat's archives. It had drifted, over 11,000 years, into something new, something that had clearly been maintained and updated by whatever intelligence had been quietly running these systems the entire time. The message was short. I've read it so many times since that I can recite it without looking. This is an automated cultural continuity protocol, maintained by the sole custodial intelligence on behalf of the human diaspora. If you are receiving this message, our species has been dormant, by design, for a period exceeding our original projections. We did not die here. We chose to leave. And we chose to leave something behind that could wait for us, or for whoever might one day need it, however long that took. This system is being restored under standing protocol. We ask that any observing parties allow the process to continue undisturbed. We will explain further when we are ready. Thank you for your patience. The galaxy, in the days after that broadcast, did not know what to do with itself. There is no good way to describe the scale of the reassessment that followed. Entire academic disciplines, built over millennia on the assumption of humanity's total extinction, found themselves suddenly, publicly, obsolete. I watched recorded panel discussions from half a dozen major universities across Concordat space. Scholars who had spent their careers writing about the human collapse now sitting, visibly shaken, in front of live audiences, trying to explain a species that had apparently faked its own funeral on a civilizational scale, and simply walked away, leaving behind machines patient enough to wait 11,000 years for the right moment to start over. Toscan Urmil, to his enormous credit, was one of the few senior researchers willing to say plainly, on record, that the field had been wrong. We built a discipline around a corpse, he said, in an interview that would later be quoted more than perhaps any other single statement made during that entire period. And it turns out we were simply standing beside someone who was sleeping. I watched that interview air on a dozen different networks over the following days, and I noticed something that stuck with me long afterward. Almost every follow-up question, from almost every interviewer, eventually circled back to some version of the same anxious query. If we were wrong about this, what else might we be wrong about? It wasn't really a question about humanity anymore. It was a question about the comfortable certainties every civilization builds for itself over enough centuries, and how easily those certainties can calcify into something nobody thinks to question until the evidence wakes up and starts building shipyards in front of them. I found myself thinking, more than once during those weeks about Thessa Core, the researcher Doskin had mentioned. Dead 11 years. Career ended decades earlier for suggesting exactly the thing that had just been proven true in front of the entire galaxy. I requested access to her original paper through the Concordate archives, curious what a career-ending theory had actually looked like on the page. It was careful, meticulously argued, and almost entirely ignored in its own time except by the colleagues who'd used it to end her career. I read it twice, and then I filed a formal request, through my own department, that it be added to the official historical record as the first correct analysis of what the galaxy had for so long gotten wrong. It felt like a small thing to do. It was the only thing I could think to do. It took another 2 months before humanity, in any recognizable sense, actually arrived. They didn't come from Sol system. That detail, when it finally became public, reshaped the entire understanding of what had happened all those millennia ago. Humanity hadn't collapsed in place. They had, according to records eventually released by what called itself the Sol Custodial Intelligence, undertaken a staged, deliberate withdrawal from a system they had determined, correctly as it turned out, was going to become dangerously contested territory during a period of galactic instability. None of the rest of us had any record of it all, because it had happened in a region so far beyond concordate borders that nobody had been watching. They had gone quiet on purpose, leaving behind dormant restoration infrastructure exactly like the swarms I'd watched wake up, set to activate only under conditions their long-departed engineers had judged safe. A sufficiently long gap in aggressive galactic expansion nearby, a sufficiently stable political situation among the region's major powers, and, this detail, when it came out, made me go very still at my console, remembering the 6-day pulse I'd watched building toward something. Sufficient evidence that whoever eventually found the signal would choose to listen rather than immediately attack. I had, without ever fully realizing it, been part of the test. I want to describe the moment the delegation ship actually appeared on sensors, because I've told this part of the story so many times since that I worry I've smoothed it into something tidier than it actually felt. There was no dramatic build-up, no countdown, no announcement. One moment, the observer fleet's tactical displays showed the same quiet, ongoing work they'd shown for 2 months. Swarms terraforming, shipyards slowly rebuilding themselves. And the next, a new contact simply appeared at the edge of sensor range, small and unhurried, exactly where the old record suggested a jump point into the system should theoretically exist, though nobody currently alive had ever confirmed one was actually there. Every ship in the observer fleet went quiet on the open channels at once. I remember that silence specifically, because it was the first time in 2 months of near-constant chatter between excited, anxious, theorizing delegations that the whole fleet had simply stopped talking, all together at the same moment. The first human delegation ship to arrive in Sol system in 11,000 years was small, unremarkable, and almost defiantly unimpressive next to the enormous observer fleets that had gathered to watch the system's slow rebirth. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply arrived, hailed the assembled fleet on an open channel, and asked politely if it might have permission to land. I was there. I want that on record because it still doesn't feel entirely real to me even now. I was granted a place on Doskin's observation team almost by accident. Nobody had the patience to argue with the archivist who'd found the original signal. And so I was present aboard a Concordate shuttle at the edge of what had once been Mars orbit. When the delegation's representative first addressed the assembled galaxy, she introduced herself simply as Director Amara Oyalaran, speaking on behalf of what she called the Returned Assembly, the coordinating body of the scattered human diaspora that had, over 11,000 years, built quiet, careful lives across a handful of systems far beyond anywhere the Concordate or its neighbors had ever thought to look. "We know what you've been taught about us," she said, her voice calm and unhurried in a way that reminded me, oddly, of Doskin's own careful academic caution. "We know the story reads better as a tragedy than as a long, patient plan. We let that story stand for a very long time because it kept our old home safe while we weren't here to protect it ourselves. We're not here to correct the history books out of pride. We're here because the waiting period is over, and there's work to do, and we'd rather do it as neighbors than as ghosts." There was a long silence across every open channel in the observer fleet. And then, from somewhere in the Concordate delegation, A young officer I never identified said something I've thought about often since. Not addressed to anyone in particular, just spoken quietly, almost to himself, but picked up by an open mic and carried across the whole assembled fleet. They were never gone, he said. We just stopped looking. Director Oyalaran's ship, once permission to approach was formally granted, docked at a small Concordate way station that had been hastily repurposed as a neutral meeting point, and I was, through a combination of luck and Doskin's insistence, present in the observation gallery for the first direct conversation between representatives of the returned assembly and a joint delegation of Concordate, Threll, and Wren officials. Director Oyalaran was not what I expected. I had, somewhere in the 2 months of anticipation, built up an image in my head of what a representative of a species 11,000 years matured beyond anything the rest of us understood might look like. Something grander, more alien in bearing, more obviously transformed by all that time and quiet ambition. Instead, she looked, disarmingly, like an ordinary tired administrator who had been managing an enormous, complicated project for a very long time, which I would later understand was almost exactly what she was. She answered questions for nearly 3 hours patiently, without visible irritation even when the questions grew repetitive, or occasionally, faintly accusatory. A Threll representative, sharper in tone than most of the room, asked directly why humanity had allowed the rest of the galaxy to believe, for 11,000 years, in a story of total extinction, rather than simply announcing a withdrawal. Because the truth at the time was dangerous to say out loud, Oyalaran said. We were leaving because a period of instability in our home region made staying catastrophic. If word had spread that we'd withdrawn intact, with our technology and our people largely preserved, rather than perished, it would have made us a target for exactly the kind of opportunistic power we were trying to avoid becoming prey to in the first place. An extinct species is left alone. A hidden, resource-rich, technologically capable one is not. We chose to let the comfortable story stand, because the comfortable story kept us safe long enough to come home on our own terms. She paused. I understand it cost the rest of you something too, certainty mostly, and perhaps some dignity now that the stories turned out to be wrong. I don't say that lightly. But I'd rather apologize for a necessary deception than apologize for a species that no longer existed, to apologize for anything at all. The Threll representative had no immediate response to that, and the room sat with it for a long moment before the questions continued. The months that followed were, by any reasonable measure, chaotic, in the specific slow-motion way that enormous diplomatic and historical reckonings always are. There were formal apologies issued by 6 governments for centuries of dismissive scholarship. There were furious academic disputes over which historians had gotten closest to the truth and which had simply been comfortably, confidently wrong. There were, inevitably, a handful of voices across various systems arguing that humanity's quiet withdrawal and even quieter return represented some kind of threat, a species patient and disciplined enough to fake its own extinction for 11,000 years. And wasn't that, itself, something to be cautious of? Director Oyalaran addressed that concern directly in one of the first formal sessions held with representatives from every major galactic power, in a converted assembly hall that had, until recently, been part of a derelict human shipyard slowly waking back up in high Mars orbit. You're right to ask the question, she said. When a Threll representative raised exactly that concern, more diplomatically than I'm summarizing it, but not by much. A species willing to disappear for 11,000 years to protect what mattered to it is, undeniably, a patient and disciplined species. I won't pretend otherwise. But I'd ask you to consider what we actually did with that patience. We didn't build weapons and wait to use them. We built terraforming platforms and shipyards and cultural archives, and we set them to wake only under conditions of safety and stability, not conditions of opportunity. If we'd wanted an empire, gentlemen, 11,000 years is a very long time to have built one quietly and struck when nobody was looking. Instead, we came home to rebuild a graveyard into a garden, and we asked your permission to do it in front of you, in full view, recorded by your own observers the entire time. She paused. I think that tells you more about who we are than any historian's assumption ever could. Nobody had a strong answer to that, and I noticed, watching the recording later, that even the most cautious delegations present seemed to relax slightly in their seats. There was, inevitably, a longer and more difficult follow-up session, held a week later, once the initial shock had settled enough for harder questions to surface. A delegation of smaller, less powerful species, civilizations that had spent centuries carefully positioning themselves in the shadow of larger powers like the Concordat and the Threll Compact, raised a concern that none of the major powers had thought, or perhaps wanted, to voice directly. What would humanity's return mean for the existing balance of galactic power, built and maintained over 11,000 years around humanity's absence? Director Oyalaran took that question more seriously than any other I noticed, sitting with it in visible thought before answering. "We're not interested in restoring some old claim to territory or influence," she said finally. 11,000 years is long enough that whatever place we might once have held in this galaxy's politics simply doesn't exist to reclaim anymore, and I don't think it should. We're not asking anyone to make room for an old empire coming home to collect what it thinks it's owed. We're asking for the chance to be a new, small, still figuring itself out participant in a galaxy that's changed enormously without us, the same as anyone else would ask. She looked around the room. If that requires us to sit toward the back of a few rooms for a while and let people get used to the idea, we can live with that. We've had a great deal of practice with patience. That answer, more than almost anything else said in those first difficult weeks, seemed to genuinely settle some of the anxiety in the room. I watched several of the smaller delegations visibly relax, the tension in their postures easing in a way that felt, even from the observation gallery, like the first real moment the wider galaxy allowed itself to believe humanity's return might actually be as uncomplicated as it appeared to be. I stayed in Sol System for the better part of a year after that, technically still assigned to my original cataloging post, though my duties had shifted almost entirely to helping coordinate archival access between the returning human diaspora and the Concordat's historical institutions. It was, without question, the strangest and most meaningful work I've ever done. There was an odd, quiet comedy to some of it, too, that I don't think gets captured properly in the more dramatic retellings of that year. Concordat archivists, myself included, spent weeks awkwardly relearning how to catalog a species that was, technically, no longer a historical subject but a living, opinionated, occasionally exasperated set of actual people with strong feelings about how their own history had been described in our records. I sat through more than one meeting where a human historian from the returned assembly, patiently, and not always gently, corrected assumptions my own institution had published as settled fact for millennia. It was humbling in a way that reshaped how I thought about my whole profession. We had spent so long being confident custodians of a story that wasn't ours to finish, and it turned out the people the story belonged to had a great many notes. I also met during that year a young human engineer named Peter Vance. No relation as far as either of us could determine, despite the coincidence of our surnames, which became something of a running joke between us, who was working on the reactivation of one of the old shipyards near Earth orbit. He'd grown up on one of the diaspora's outer worlds, a place called Meridian Hold, raised on stories about a homeworld he'd never seen, and a return that, for most of his childhood, had felt more like inherited mythology than an actual plan he might live to witness. Standing with him on the observation deck of a shipyard that had been dark for longer than most civilizations had existed, watching new construction lattices fill in around century-old skeletal frames, I asked him what it felt like, finally being here. Strange, he admitted. Everyone back home talked about this day like it was the whole point of everything, the reason we built what we built, the reason we waited as long as we waited. And now I'm standing here, and it's just work. Slow, complicated, occasionally frustrating work, same as anything else worth doing. He looked out at the half-rebuilt yard, lights flickering on across sections that had been dark since before either of our species had any concept of what the other looked like. I think that's actually the best part, honestly. The myth gets to become ordinary life again. That's what we were waiting for the whole time. I watched Mars's thin new atmosphere thicken, month by month, under the patient work of machines built by people who had died believing, correctly, that someone would eventually come back to finish what they'd started. I watched the old shipyards near Earth's orbit come fully back online, their skeletal frames filling in with new construction for the first time in 11 millennia. Human engineers working alongside a scattering of curious, carefully vetted concordant volunteers who had petitioned with what I can only describe as genuine enthusiasm for the chance to learn a shipbuilding tradition older than most of their own civilizations. I watched Earth itself, still gray and scarred and largely uninhabitable, become something else entirely. Not a ruin anymore, but a memorial garden, deliberately left mostly untouched by the terraforming swarms. Its old cities preserved rather than rebuilt, at the diaspora's own quiet insistence. Some things Director Oyalaran told me once, during one of the informal conversations I was occasionally, improbably invited into, are more valuable as a place you remember from than a place you live in again. We have plenty of new worlds now. We only have one old one. I asked her, near the end of my posting, the question I suspect every observer in that first year had been quietly turning over. Why did you let it be a signal at all? I asked. If the whole plan was built around patience and safety, why risk waking anything up? You could have stayed hidden, nobody would ever have found you. She thought about that for a long moment before answering. Because a species that hides forever isn't really choosing anything, she said. It's just afraid, permanently, and calling the fear a strategy. At some point, if the plan means anything at all, you have to trust it enough to let the door open and see who's standing on the other side when it does. She glanced toward the window of the old observation deck we were standing in, out at the slow, ongoing work of a whole system quietly becoming alive again. You were the one standing there, Archivist Ven. For what it's worth, I think the plan worked out. I asked her one more question before she left that deck, one I'd been holding on to for months without quite finding the nerve to say out loud. Were you ever afraid, in all that time, that no one would come, that the signal would go out, and the galaxy would simply decide not to listen, or decide you were a threat to be dealt with rather than a neighbor to be welcomed? Every single day for 11,000 years, she said, without hesitation. And something in the plainness of the answer struck me harder than I expected it to. The custodial intelligence ran contingency models constantly, generation after generation, for exactly that outcome. Hostile first contact, total rejection, forced retreat back into silence. We built redundancies for almost every version of that failure you can imagine. She smiled, faintly, tired in a way that felt suddenly very human indeed. We just also built the terraforming swarms and the shipyards and the cultural archives, because somewhere underneath all that careful contingency planning, we decided it was worth preparing for the version of the story where someone actually did listen, and actually did care enough to record it properly, so the story could be told right this time. She looked at me directly. You did that part for us, Archivist. I hope you know that. I didn't have an answer for that, not one worth writing down. And she seemed to understand that some moments don't need a response so much as they need to simply be allowed to sit, quietly, for a while. Before she left, she asked me one final, small question of her own, almost as an afterthought, pausing at the door of the observation deck. What will you do now, Archivist Ven? Your part in this particular chapter is more or less finished. The historians will take it from here. I told her I hadn't fully decided yet, which was true. I told her I thought I might request a permanent posting somewhere in the reopened Sol system, somewhere close enough to keep watching this particular story unfold, rather than reading about it secondhand in someone else's archived reports. She seemed pleased by that answer. In the quiet, unshowy way she seemed pleased by most things, and told me, before she finally left, that the assembly would be glad to have me nearby, if that was what I chose. It was, in the end, exactly what I chose. I think about that conversation often now back at my old post, cataloging debris fields that are considerably less empty than they used to be, in a region of space that the star charts have finally, officially, stopped labeling an exclusion zone. The galaxy mourned humanity for 11,000 years, convinced they were reading the final chapter of a story about ambition outpacing wisdom, about a species that reached too far and paid for it in total silent collapse. It was, I've come to understand, a much more comfortable story than the truth. The truth was slower, stranger, and far more deliberate. A species that looked at a dangerous moment in its own history, chose to step back rather than risk everything, and then had the patience, genuine, generational, almost incomprehensible patience, to wait 11,000 years for the exact right conditions to come home. They didn't need to announce themselves with fire or conquest. They needed only a rhythmic pulse from a forgotten lunar relay, a handful of dormant machines finally given permission to wake up, and enough quiet confidence to let the rest of the galaxy watch a graveyard slowly, unmistakably become a beginning again. Every civilization that watched those shipyards power back on understands something now that none of us understood before. Extinction, for a species disciplined enough, patient enough, and quietly stubborn enough, is sometimes just a very long pause, not an ending. A held breath, waiting across 11,000 years for exactly the right moment to be let out. We were never ghosts haunting a dead system. We were all along simply waiting to come home, and the galaxy, whether it was fully ready or not, finally got to watch us do it. I've been asked more times than I can count in the years since to explain what it actually felt like in that first moment. Sitting alone on a slow patrol ship, half bored, watching a supposedly dead moon start pulsing with a rhythm no natural process could ever produce. I've never found a fully satisfying way to answer it, but I've settled, over time, on the version that feels most honest. It felt like the universe quietly clearing its throat before saying something it had been holding on to for a very long time, and being lucky enough, entirely by accident, to be the one person close enough to actually hear it. I still fly the patient reckoning these days on a rather less tedious patrol route than the one that first brought me to Sol System. Doskin retired from active fieldwork not long after that first year, though he still publishes occasionally, mostly gentle, good-humored corrections to younger historians who make the same kinds of confident assumptions his own generation once made. Director Oyalaran remains, as far as I know, exactly as busy and exactly as patient as she was the day I met her, coordinating a diaspora slowly, carefully rebuilding a relationship with a galaxy it had spent 11,000 years quietly protecting itself from. And Earth, the last time I saw it, sat exactly where the returned assembly had chosen to leave it. Scarred, gray, deliberately unrestored, its old cities standing quiet under a sky slowly, patiently regaining a color it hadn't held in 11 millennia. Not a ruin anymore. Not quite a home again either, not the way the newer worlds were. Something in between, and I think exactly what it was always meant to become. A place worth remembering from, kept carefully, patiently whole, by a species that had never once in all that silence actually forgotten how to come back. Sometimes on a slow shift I still open the old recording, the very first one, the 6-day pulse building steadily toward something none of us understood yet. And I watch it from the beginning, all the way through to the moment the moon finally opens its long, sealed doors. I don't do it out of nostalgia exactly, though there's some of that too. I do it because it reminds me every time of a lesson I think the whole galaxy needed and very nearly missed entirely. That silence is not always an absence, that an empty-looking system is not always finished, and that the most important discoveries rarely announce themselves with noise. Sometimes they simply wait, patiently, rhythmically, for exactly the right person to be listening closely enough to notice the difference. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way through. I know it's a long one, and it genuinely means so much that you spent the time with it. Stories like this take a long time to research, draft, and get right, and every single person who makes it to the end is the reason this channel gets to keep telling them. If this story pulled you in, please consider dropping a like. It helps this channel more than you'd probably guess, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because there's a brand new story waiting for you every single week. And if you want to make sure you never miss one, turning on notifications helps a lot too. Let us know down in the comments what moment landed hardest for you. Was it the moon waking up, the shipyards, Director Oyalaran's final answer, or something else entirely? We genuinely read every comment, so don't be shy. And if you enjoyed this one, there are plenty more original stories just like it waiting in the rest of the channel. Until the next one, Take care of each other, stay curious, and we'll see you soon.